Welcome to this series, Living in Wholeness, brought to you by the Unitive Narrative and Holistic Cosmology Synergy Circles of the Evolutionary Leaders, along with Light on Light publications and media. This series features global thought leaders dialoguing with Dr. Robert Atkinson, developmental psychologist and award-winning author of the 2022 Light on Light book, A New Story of Wholeness, an experiential guide for connecting the human family. Forward by Jean Houston, afterword by Deepak Chopra. I'm Dr. Kurt Johnson of the Evolutionary Leaders Synergy Circles and Light on Light. Each video will engage Dr. Atkinson in a discussion with a global thought leader on the themes in his book. Drawing from mythology, mysticism, rites of passage, and psychology, this book is a synthesis of his work in personal myth-making, soul-making, and storytelling to identify a pattern within our unconscious that guides our evolving consciousness, transforms our lives, keeps our focus on the wholeness of all things, and keeps humanity on its evolutionary trajectory. Framed by a clear expression of the principles underlying this pattern, New Story of Wholeness uncovers the innate pattern for living into wholeness by laying out all of the tools that are needed to identify that pattern within our own life experience. The guest or guests of each video will be introduced immediately after this short introduction of Dr. Robert Atkinson. Dr. Robert Atkinson, PhD, award-winning author, educator, and developmental psychologist, is a 2020 Gold Nautilus Book Award winner and co-editor of Our Moment of Choice, Evolutionary Visions and Hope for the Future, and a 2017 Silver Nautilus Book Award winner for The Story of Our Time, From Duality to Interconnectedness to Oneness. He is also the author and co-editor of 9 other books, including A New Story of Wholeness, an experiential guide for connecting the human family, 2022, The Year of Living Deeply, a memoir of 1969, 2019, Mystic Journey, Getting to the Heart of Your Soul's Story, 2012, and The Gift of Stories, 1995. With a PhD in cross-cultural human development from the University of Pennsylvania and a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Chicago, he is professor emeritus at the University of Southern Maine and an internationally recognized authority on life story interviewing, pioneer in the techniques of personal myth-making and soul-making. He's director of the Story Commons and founder of the One Planet Peace Forum and a member of the Evolutionary Leaders. You can find out more at robertatkinson.net. So let's go over now and introduce the guest for this episode's discussion. The guest for this episode is Deepak Chopra. Deepak Chopra, MD, FACP, is the co-founder of the Chopra Center for Wellbeing and the founder of the Chopra Foundation, and a world-renowned pioneer in integrative medicine and personal transformation. He is board certified in internal medicine, endocrinology, and metabolism, and is a fellow of the American College of Physicians, a member of the American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists, and a clinical professor in family medicine and public health at the University of California, San Diego. He is the author of more than 85 books translated into 43 languages, including numerous New York Times bestsellers. His most recent books include Metahuman, Abundance, Living in the Light, Mindful Moments, Total Meditation, and Quantum Body. the covers of which you can see in a banner at the conclusion of this video. You can learn more at deepakchopra.com. So now over to Doctors Robert Atkinson and Deepak Chopra.
Hello, my friends. I'm back again with another conversation with a very important influencer in our world who's written a new book. And here is the book. It's called A New Story of Wholeness, an experiential guide for connecting the human family. I was privileged to write the afterword to this book. So thank you for joining me. Thank you so much, Robert, for joining me this morning.
Thank you, Deepak. It's great to be with you. And thank you for the afterward. Much appreciated.
It's a privilege. Now, tell me a little bit about why you wrote this book.
Well, it's really been a lifelong process of, I could go into a lot of details of my early life to kind of lay the groundwork for this, but I guess the real, where I could start really though is when I, after my bachelor's degree, after my first master's degree, I started a series of adventures that just led me from one thing to another that gave me the sense eventually that I was, wherever I was the place that was waiting for me to show up kind of thing. And so I started out, after I had met Pete Seeger the year before, he invited me to sail on the maiden voyage of the Hudson River Sloop Clearwater from New York to Albany. And that, of course, was the summer of 1969. And we got to Albany just in time for some of us to attend Woodstock Festival. And then that fall, I had a cabin in the woods that he helped me find. And one day later that fall or early winter, I decided to take a trip a day trip into the city, which is just an hour down from where I was living. And I was in the 8th Street bookshop reading a book, and that I noticed in the window. I had picked the book up. I was reading it, and then I glanced at the bulletin board right in front of me, and there was a poster describing a talk that Joseph Campbell was giving that night, whose book I was reading. And so I had just enough time to get to Cooper Union, a few blocks away, to attend his talk that evening. And that was where it really began for me, because I sat down in the Great Hall. It filled up around me, and there he was talking about the journey of the hero, the monomyth that I was living at that time through my experiences. So after the talk, I went up and I introduced myself and I met him, and we became friends. He invited me to his home a couple of times, and he became my mentor. And it was when I met him totally serendipitously in 1970 at one of his Cooper Union lectures that I was in the midst of living the pattern that he was talking about, and he became the mentor, and that very much influenced all the rest of my work from then on, including the first book that I published in 1974, which was an interesting little book called Songs of the Open Road, the Poetry of Folk Rock and the Journey of the Hero, which illustrated how the lives of songwriters of that time, through their lyrics, followed the same pattern themselves. And then in 1995, I devoted a good portion of my book, The Gifts of Stories, to the process of personal myth making. And now with this new book, this pattern is significantly expanded and updated to highlight even more how it is truly universal, going beyond mythology to include the same pattern found in mysticism, rites of passage, psychology. And so it's really been a lifelong process of having the whole pattern that I was living at that time way back become even bigger and larger in my own mind and truly universal. in the sense that we all experience it in our own lives at various times.
Speaking.
So the book is really meant to be a roadmap to help others identify that pattern in their own lives.
I'm speaking to Robert Atkinson. His new book is called A New Story of Wholeness, an experiential guide for connecting the human family. Robert is author of several other books, which are very insightful and illuminating, but this is now the culmination of all that thinking as well. So Robert, what I'd like to do is actually go over the chapter headings and have you comment maybe 2 or 3 sentences on each. My own journey personally has been guided by 2 very interesting questions that are considered the 2 most important questions in science, open questions in science. The first open question in science is what's the universe made of? And I came to the conclusion, after many years of reflecting on that the universe is made of nothing. And the second open question in science is what's the biological basis of consciousness? And I came to the conclusion there's no biological basis of consciousness. Biology is an experience in consciousness. And it's kind of followed your path, from me to we to oneness. But let's go over these chapter headings very briefly. So part 1, you call Healing the Illusion of Separation. And the first title over there in part 1, chapter 1, the evolution principle. Please tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah, that's the first kind of underlying principle that is really the basis of of the other 2 that we'll get to, I guess. So evolution is a really interesting and important part of the whole picture of everything. And I guess one way to look at that is to go back to where the public's awareness of evolution really began, which was with Charles Darwin. I mean, before him, evolution wasn't even thought of that much publicly, but he brought it into the public consciousness. And the problem, though, when Darwin brought his theory, which is now 1.75 centuries ago, he based his theory on a lot of things, one of which was the concept of the tree of life, where everything sprung from the same origin, basically, and branched out in the form of a tree. What happened, though, was there was a huge misunderstanding of the nature of evolution after Darwin. And we know about Darwinists and social Darwinism, and that's where the problem came in, I think, because that's they really turned his theory upside down and let it become a focus on survival of the fittest and competition needed to sustain that. And that has fueled that idea of turning Darwin's theory upside down, really fueled generations of oppression, and which led to segregation, racism, genocide, wars, everything. But Darwin himself wasn't there. I mean, he even though his basis was biological evolution, he also talked a lot, or at least enough, about social evolution for us to know how that tree of life would unfold over centuries. And in his 1871 book, The Descent of Man, which is an odd title because it's really about the ascent of man, he really clearly stated his views of social evolution. And this is what my chapter there is based on, pretty much. He said, as man advances in civilization and small tribes are united into the larger communities, the simplest reason would tell us each individual that he ought to extend his social instincts and sympathies to all members of the same nation, though personally unknown to him. This point being reached, there is only an artificial barrier to prevent his sympathies extending to the men of all nations and races. So he's really talking about expanding the golden rule from the individual level to the collective level, and talking about social evolution expanding level by level from family to community to the nation to the global level. But that's totally, that part of Darwin is totally ignored. So that's the basis of my chapter on evolution, that there's a purpose to evolution, and that purpose has a direction, as Darwin described, basically.
So what you're saying is beyond random mutations and natural selection, there is a guiding principle that orchestrates the evolution, and that guiding principle could be the second thing you mentioned here, the consciousness principle. So please go ahead and say a few words about that.
Right. That's where the consciousness principle comes in. When we think about consciousness, that has, and if, first of all, if evolution is the sort of the primary overriding principle, then consciousness is part of that, because we are talking about a wholeness, and even though we've gotten into the long-term habit of dividing wholeness up, it's really indivisible on a level, and consciousness follows that same principle. So the way that I talk about that principle of consciousness is that basically comes down to consciousness is an innate potentiality, but it's dependent upon the initiative we take to actively investigate reality. So we have that potential of the direction that evolution is taking us within us. And in order for that potential to reach its fullest extent, we have to become active in and proactive in seeking an understanding of reality. And all the sacred traditions talk about seek and ye shall find. There's so many variations on that becomes an essential part of the consciousness principle as well. We have to consciously seek what it is that we don't understand in order to understand it. And then, of course, that process leads us to the third principle.
And that third principle you call the wholeness principle. And that basically suggests that anything that we experience as separate is actually an impermanent pattern of behavior of the whole. Like I look at anything, for example, my own body, and I look at individual organs and cells. They all seem to be doing different things, but they're entangled in the wholeness that we call the body. And the same thing applies to the entire universe, that what we call force fields, gravity, atoms, molecules are actually modes of knowing and experience, where every experience is entangled with every other experience in this formless, infinite background of beingness. Am I kind of translating that accurately?
Yeah, definitely. That's where and how the wholeness principle comes in, which says that reality is one and all of creation is a whole. So if we understand wholeness in that way, that reality is one and that all of creation is a whole, and we all also understand the first two, we can put those three together and end up with sort of a meta principle of consciousness evolves toward wholeness. That's really what it all comes down to. And that's happening whether we're aware of it or not, because there are also forces that are guiding us, leading us toward having our consciousness unfold and evolve toward wholeness.
And that wholeness includes the objects of our perception, like this thing which is made of metal, or my iPhone, or this book. It's all part of the same wholeness.
Exactly. Can't be otherwise.
Mhm.
Because
That gets us very interestingly into part 2, finding connection in apparent randomness. And that apparent randomness could be what some people call synchronicity. It's the interweaving of space-time events that appear random but are actually interdependently co-arising. Correct?
right. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about this call to wholeness then.
Well, yeah, and I think it's important to look at that on both the individual level and the collective level, because it's because the call to wholeness is happening on both of those levels at the same time, and always has been. But maybe I could preface that and talking about this, finding the connections between randomness. I can put that in the context of a not only of wholeness itself. I mean, your afterword is so perfect when you say wholeness is what we are. That's what the book comes down to, and I try to illustrate throughout the book as well that wholeness is all there is. But what happened was we we're undergoing a process, a deep inner journey to get to this realization, because we get lost in the details and in the parts of the whole, which creates the illusion of separation. But we are talking about the story of the evolution of consciousness, and we are on the way back to where we came from, both individually and collectively. And so humanity has been on this journey forever. But we've seen this wholeness differently at different times in our existence. And the way we can visualize these differences in the way we've seen wholeness is as a cyclical unfolding of consciousness. So there are a few ways we can express this variation in the cyclical flow. A couple of those are unity followed by disunity, followed by unity, or wholeness followed by separation, followed by wholeness, or coherence followed by incoherence, followed by coherence. And that's how all the variations are talking about the same pattern of the evolution of consciousness. And I'll just take a minute here to share a short story of which we could think of as a storyteller's history of the world, which illustrates this as well. There was a time when people gathered to share stories that embodied the values and principles they lived by. These stories held the community together and gave them a shared purpose. They were unitive narratives, essential to their individual and collective well-being. Then there came a time when communities expanded, spread out, became more diverse, and experienced conflict and disorder. Out of this discord emerged divisive narratives that maintained separation. Today, as we approach a consciousness of global integration, a new story of our wholeness is needed to frame this interconnectedness. It's time to come together again through unitive narratives to share our own stories of living into wholeness. So that's a quick storyteller's view of the how stories evolved over the millennia, and nothing may be more important right now than a healing vision that guides us toward wholeness. So that's where a new story of wholeness comes in, by decoding that pattern hidden within the structure of story itself. And of course, that's all based on not only the work of Joseph Campbell in mythology and Evelyn Underhill and mysticism and others, but it also goes way back to the Hermetic principle of as above, so below, all things accomplishing the miracles of the one thing. And even Plato, who gave us a vision of this wholeness as well. He said, perhaps there is a pattern set up in the heavens for one who desires to see it, and having seen it, to find one in himself. So that's what this book really provides, is the roadmap for being able to see that pattern within ourselves and how we live it out through our life experiences. So it's basically about a core pattern of transformation that keeps us moving along a trajectory intended to guide us from separation to union or wholeness. And that pattern is evident in the basic structure of story too, which is not just beginning, middle, and end, but in a much deeper and more meaningful level, beginning, muddle, and resolution. Because it's the muddles or challenges we face that represent the core of the pattern that brings the process of transformation to its completion or resolution. So when we merge all these ways of knowing together, we come up with what I've described there as the three parts of call to wholeness, path of purification, and return to wholeness.
And so the path of purification is the path that leads to that return. What does that purification involve?
Yeah, there's many names for that, and if anyone's familiar with mysticism, that's also known as the dark night of the soul, or in mythology, the road of trials. That's a necessary part of our journey and of the process of transformation, in order to, first of all, become aware of what our challenges are, what our difficulties are, and how we have the innate capacity to manage and overcome them. So that path of purification or that dark night of the soul, maybe many, I'm sure, have experienced that as the most difficult time in their lives, but it's also the most important time in our lives when we become aware, become conscious of the difficulties and the challenges that we're facing, and that they have a purpose for us, which is to bring us through that muddle and into the resolution, or to that return to wholeness. Once we've gone through that dark night of the soul, that path of purification, we're then ready for our return to wholeness. And we can live in that consciousness of wholeness after that. And that's where and when and how all things that were previously separate become united as parts of the whole that is all.
I've been speaking to Robert Atkinson, who's the author of A New Story of Wholeness, an experiential guide for connecting the human family. And at the end of this book, Robert actually has some very practical exercises. I just give you a glimpse of these. Call to Wholeness worksheet, which involves waking up, entering the unknown, a journey to higher consciousness, the beginning of transformation, the struggles that appear as the dark night of the soul, the opportunities that come out of that. And there's another section called to Wholeness, shaping a narrative, and then a workspace for path of purification, and many other guidelines for the return of wholeness. The word wholeness is related to the word healing, and so healing is the return of the memory of wholeness. Health, healing, wholeness are all a holy experience where the shattered pieces of our soul come back together as the wholeness of all existence. So please pick up this book. You'll find it very interesting and very useful, and it could just change your life. The book also has a foreword by one of my favorite people in the world, Jean Houston, and endorsements by many other luminaries in the field of consciousness and deeper understanding of what we call reality. So thank you very much for joining me, Robert. I wish you all success. And I think this book is going to have a big impact on anyone who's fortunate enough to pick it up and read it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks to our viewers. Each of the subsequent videos in this important video series will feature discussions with Dr. Robert Atkinson in the context of his book, A New Story of Wholeness, an experiential guide for connecting the human family. You can update yourself regularly on the series at the websites posted just hereafter, which include robertatkinson.net, lightonlight.us, the Light on Light Press and Light on Light Magazine Facebook pages, and at the Evolutionary Leaders channel at YouTube. That's YouTube at the Evolutionary Leaders channel. Thank you for joining us, and please tell your colleagues about this important video series. This is Dr. Kurt Johnson of Light on Light Media and of the Synergy Circles of the Evolutionary Leaders project of the Source of Synergy Foundation. And please also see all of our emerging work on the central issues of our time at evolutionaryleaders.net and holomovement.net. That's HOLO movement.net.